there's a lit cubicle, and that is where, oops, yes, there are some more people on Zoom. So as I'm doing the housekeeping, I'll just omit some more people. So yes, so the toilet's around the corner, and feel free to use those when you need to. The copies of the book are front and centre at the counter, and we'll be going inside to do a signing afterwards. So do check check out the copies. There's a big stack of them at the counter, and then we'll have a chat about it afterwards as well. Okay, so as we're just gathering, if you have your phone with you, you could switch that to silent. That'd be great. We do encourage social media, so if you do want to, you know, tweet or Facebook or Instagram, or like really, what would you do? What would TikTok do with an event like this? Would you just like, is there a book talk you could do? Whatever you do on TikTok that I don't understand yet, because I haven't downloaded the app, you are free to do that tonight. I may regret saying that as someone jumps up and does some kind of song, which seems to be what TikTok is all about. Feel free to join us, just grab a seat. Oops, one more, sorry about the double handling as we're just getting ourselves ready, but I'll just let more people in on Zoom. Great. All right, I think we're just about ready to go. Well, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on. In this area, it's the Yagara and Turrbal people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also, because we're on Zoom, we're going out onto the lands of many different Aboriginal people around Australia. This is and always was Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. And my respects to elders of the places that you are zooming in from. Now, it's my great pleasure to be welcoming Lee Kofman. I'm Krissy Kneen, by the way, and Lee and I have been friends for many years. And in fact, we were just saying, this will be the third book that I have discussed of Lee's in this very space. So this is becoming an affair.
I love it, yeah. Affair is better than finished.
So Lee Kofman was Russian-born, Melbourne-based, and a highly regarded memoirist, novelist, editor, writing coach, and a charismatic force in Australian literature. I can attest to that. Her writing and reading life began a long time ago in a remote Siberian village, which sounds so romantic, really.
Where now with all the food and stuff.
It was romantic until a year ago, maybe. No, it's still quite romantic. Where she recited her first poem to an admiring crowd of illiterate babushkas. The best kind. What followed was decades of wrestling with the art and craft of writing and passionate reading. Everybody please welcome Lee Kofman. Lee, I'm a bit of a ring-in tonight because Miranda was going to take over from Cass and do the conversation, and then she got COVID. So I'm a last-minute ring-in, but I felt very comfortable joining you because I know that we have discussed your other books before. I know you're writing, and as a writer, I think this is the perfect conversation for the two of us to have together. Because really we could just sit down here and talk about what we do, and we'd cover a lot of the areas that are in your book. But I have been able to get across your book. But before I talk about the questions that I have about your book, I have Miranda's preamble that she gave me, because she said I think we're going to get rid of that hiss now too, I think. Miranda, who was going to be doing the conversation until yesterday, said, I was one of the lucky ones to read this early on. I wish I'd just such a book when I was writing my first manuscripts, but still finding things to learn from here. Indeed, this is a book for any writer at any stage of their career. So generous to find the time to write and the blog and share this information in such detail. All writing is learning about our process, what we need to write, about the subject matter. This stuff I might have known or worked out instinctively over years and years of writing, but here we have it all written down so clearly. and so many yes moments reading this book and learning from it. And her words, I think, were echoed today when I picked this book up for the first time and started to read it and just went, of course, this is exactly what you need to know to actually sit down and start writing. But it's not just that. This is a book about philosophy, process, and there are lots of things in here to keep you writing once you've started. So it's not just a book where, you know, you get an A, B, C, D of how to write, but this is a book of how to continue to keep a writing practice going. And I want to know what inspired you to sit down and write this book. What was it that kicked off the idea that you could share that knowledge?
Thank you so much, Krissy. Just before I answer your question, I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here today, stepping in the last moment, but I also want to commend you for your courage of doing it, because clearly it's not very good to launch my books, because in Melbourne or Monaco, I was supposed to launch my book and then she broke her shoulder. So my friend had to step in, Lee Kofman, and launch it in the last moment. And here, Cass Moriarty was supposed to launch, and I thank her for all the preparations, and due to family circumstances, she couldn't do it. And then Miranda stepped in, and then there's a COVID.
You never know what's happening tomorrow. So far, so good, but touch wood about that.
So thank you.
No worries.
In terms of inspiration, so I would have loved to sort of claim the credit for writing this book to myself, but actually it was my publisher who suggested to do this. So I published. It's my third book with Ventura Press, and actually in the first book I edited for Ventura Press, Rebellious Daughters, an anthology. Krissy has a wonderful piece. And that's sort of, I think, how we connected initially. My publisher sort of was reading my blog on writing, which I've been writing for some years now. And I know that there are some people in the audience, Warren, I'm looking at you, who read this blog and sometimes make very good, insightful comments. So Jane, my publisher, said, "Why wouldn't you write a book based on your blog?" But I kind of, so first of all, I was really excited because I often thought about it, but I had this sort of feeling in me like, oh, who am I to sort of, talk about writing? So it was like a dream come true initially. But then I really panicked because I was thinking, well, there's so many books on writing already out there. I mean, my bookshelf of books on writing is really bursting. What can I possibly add to the conversation? And it's one of the things one of the types of books on writing I actually don't like and don't collect, and you mentioned this, Krissy, is books that sort of tell you how to write, like 10 steps to creating your best-selling novel, this sort of type. But then I thought about what actually prompted me to blog about the writing process initially. So I started blogging about writing maybe 14 years ago or so, maybe a bit less, but it was a time in my life when I was in my early 30s. Oh no, that has to be then longer than that. I'm in my late 40s now. Anyway, chronology aside. In my early 30s, I got really blocked. And now I know that some writers do, and I know most people here are writers today. So I don't know how about you, but I know some writers don't believe in the existence of writer's block. And I'm happy for them.
That's really funny. I'm doing a conversation with Graham Simpson about his How to Write book next Friday. And he has said exactly that. He said there is no such thing as writer's block. And I kind of read it and went,
he's very lucky. That's what Yes, in fact, and actually there is, I'm very interested in neuroscience, the intersection between creativity and neuroscience. And despite a lot of research has been recently into this phenomenon of writer's block, and there are some findings that would argue with Graham Simpson's position. There are some emerging findings that when people feel blocked creatively, it's actually, they have the same similar symptoms to anxiety. So there is something that is happening in the brain akin to mental health. Anyway, for me, in my experience, there's a lot of symptoms. There are lots of ways also to get blocked. For me, what happened in my early 30s, for about 4 years, I wrote as much as I normally write. So I wasn't lazy or procrastinating or making excuses. I was at my desk like a soldier. But I really hated everything I wrote, and I had good reason to hate what I wrote, because I actually wasn't honest in what I wrote. It wasn't like I was lying, but I even coined the word for this, honesty. It wasn't like lies, but I was just not trying to be honest about the human condition itself. That sounds very philosophical. We have a philosopher today in the crowd. I began looking at you, Warren. Basically, I kind of tried to skim the surfaces. So I would write things like, she loved him, or he felt sad, but I didn't sort of acknowledge the fact that love has different shades and complexities, and just to love somebody doesn't mean you don't hate them, for example, sometimes. And everybody who has been married or in a long relationship probably knows what I'm talking about. And also sadness has so many different types and shades, and changes not just from every person, but for a person in different situations. So I was not honest in this way, but I also lost touch with my creative process. So I kind of had this idea that the writer has to write in a certain way. For example, polish every sentence they write until it's perfect and only then move on. And of course, things did not work for me very well. For some writers, it works. That's the way of writing. Anidilo, the American writer, writes like this, but for me, it didn't. And so I kind of struggled with this for 4 years until for all sorts of, all sorts of complicated ways I did get out of this block. But when I was thinking, what do I want to write about? I was thinking, really, when I experienced the block, most of my difficulties could be traced to this idea of not being honest with myself about how I work best and how, and what am I actually describing? So this is how I thought, well, why wouldn't I write a book that sort of I needed at the time?
Mm. Well, it'd be interesting to actually go into your manuscript of this book and do a word search and find how many times you use the word honesty or honest, or how many times you use the word truth. Because as I was doing my very quick read through today, I was struck by the fact that this is a book about honesty and about truth, and that is what you're posing is the fundamental way to write well, not to write, because obviously you can write and not be honest, but to write well is to kind of hit those points of honesty.
Absolutely, and I think it starts with the very sort of basics. I mean, one of the reasons I was blocked at the time was because I wasn't even honest about what I wanted to write about. I think it really starts already there. So at the time, there are multiple reasons for why I got blocked, which I now understand in hindsight. I wish I knew it then, and I won't cite them all. But I think one of the main things was it was at the time when I was new to Australia. So I was really sort of struggling to change languages, to start writing in English. And I'm also struggling with writer's identity because I came from Israel, where I already had 3 books published. And here I was starting from complete scratch, not knowing anybody. And so I was really fixated on this idea of getting published. Yeah. And I kind of wanted to please people. So I didn't know I kind of felt that I have to find this sort of topic that Australian audiences would be really interested in.
You were trying to write the great Australian book.
Well, not even to this extent. But I was trying to write. No, I was trying to actually exoticize myself because a lot of people who met me, they were all very fascinated by my Russian childhood, especially what we always had. My parents were dissidents, and we always had KGB 24/7, like at our house, and there were lots of dramatic adventures. So that was like the obvious thing to write about, and everybody I met wanted to know about this. I even got grants for this.
Yeah, of course.
And so of course I decided I'm going to write it to please everybody, but I actually didn't want to write about it. I didn't want to write about something exotic. I wanted to write about something possibly exotic, but in a different way, about my experiences of non-monogamy. But at the time, it was not like today when we all know what polyamory, for example, is. I mean, we still think quite conservative, but I was thinking about writing it at the time, but nobody even knew really what polyamory meant. And so I was really sort of ashamed of my topic and trying not to write about this because I thought nobody would want to write. So of course I got blocked. So yeah, so I really think honesty is fundamental, even at how we decide what we are going to work on.
And I suppose one of the things in your chapter about voice You talk a little bit about that period of time when you were blocked and when you were trying to write in English for the first time. Can you talk a little bit about that process and how it was? Because you come from Russia, but you are Jewish, and you went to Israel, and then you lived there for a long period of time before coming here. So that's kind of a bit of a cultural shift. And then you decided to write in a completely different language. So Lee, it's not really an easy path you chose to, hey, I'll just be a writer in another language completely. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, it was pretty hard. In fact, I actually decided to give up on reading in Hebrew and Russian for about more than a decade in order to really swim and in English, really to absorb the language. And I even gave up on something I really love, which is television. I didn't actually, until lockdowns, I didn't watch television for 15 years. It's sort of I broke my Netflix virginity, but anyway.
Lockdowns will do that to you.
But yeah, so I really so I did sort of take the right steps externally to make the space for starting to write in a new language. What I did not really take into consideration is how much language shapes us. Because I've never written creatively in Russian, but I do speak Russian and I read in Russian quite fluently. And when I speak in Russian, I left Russia when I was 12. And in my Russian, I sound like a little girl still. I'm kind of frozen with time. I'm differential to anybody who is not a teenager. Doesn't matter how much younger they are than me. When I speak Hebrew, I am tougher, I have more bravado, more brusque. And that's also how I wrote when I wrote in Hebrew. And so I wrote a bit more sort of, not like Hemingway or anything like that, but my writing was a bit more masculine than it is now in English. When I came to Australia, I didn't acknowledge the fact that in English I was going to sound probably differently. I was so again stressed about this getting published, which of course I didn't manage for a long time because of all that sort of stress. I just short pieces, but I couldn't write a book. So I kind of ignored, that's again about honesty. I wasn't honest enough about who I was becoming, and I was becoming a different person because in Israel, as migrants, we sort of lived in very tough neighborhoods with a lot of crime, and that's the kind of places I grew up, and that's why I wrote quite in a very masculine fashion. One of my neighbors was one of the most famous diamond smugglers in our town. So that was the dealing. And then when I came to Australia, I ended up...
people wanted you to write the kind of exotic Russian stories and diamond smuggler story.
That was actually in Israel. But yeah, in Russia we had babushkas, don't they?
All of it. But yes, go on.
But then in Australia, I kind of ended up having, well, apart from my non-monogamous adventures, my life was relatively tame because I kind of ended up in this ivory tower of academy, and I was moving in circles of artists and writers mostly. So I was a bit different person, but I didn't acknowledge it. And so because I kind of always had this stupid idea that writer's voice is something like an object. So you developed it, you've got it, and here it is, you put it on your bookshelf and just sits there and you're fine. But it's not, because I think it evolves over the years as we evolve. So
yeah, and when you change cultures, that was another thing too. I think I've underlined the exact phrase that you used about culture being in the body. You talk about that it's enculturated bodies. You talk about how culture lives inside you and you're not even necessarily aware of your cultural kind of bodily way of being, which completely changes when you change places that you're living.
So true, yes, I do. Like even my gestures, I mean, they have changed a lot. I remember when I was in my first months in Australia, I worked as a kitchen hand in some video library, Australian video library, and a customer came in and I was on the phone and I did this. And the customer thought I was so rude. But in Israel, this is a polite gesture, it just means, please wait. So now that I'm now when I write, I'm really thinking about these things, about how much through the body, we need to be also honest about the body and what about bodies tell about us. So I think writing the body honestly, and I know, Krissy, that's your sort of passion. Just talk. Am I allowed to say it?
Yeah.
You've written a memoir just now about the body, so you would know better than me that to write honestly about the bodies, to consider the fact that our bodies are to some extent cultural products. So even though my gesture was, but they're not just, so although my gesture was Israeli when I did this, it was also me because I moderated it. I'm a bit more gentle than the average Israeli, I suppose. So I didn't do it sort of rudely, you know. So
It was a gentle kind of rude gesture.
Yeah.
But these are things that you bring in your body, but you also put these things even without noticing it necessarily on the page. So every one of us who's a writer here in the room will kind of approach a body in space with a whole lot of baggage that we're not even necessarily aware of, that will change the way your characters relate to the world. Is there a way of writing outside of your own bodily experiences? How do you get to that point if it's so blind that we are? Yeah,
that's a great question, exactly, and that's why I think it doesn't matter whether people write fiction or creative nonfiction. I teach a lot. I mean, writing is one of my sort of main means of making money. I don't make money from my books.
nobody does.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah. Welcome to Australia.
But when I teach writing, I think I speak about understanding yourself, self-understanding, including understanding your prejudices and your biases about your body, about anything else. As a necessity, not just for memoirists, but for fiction writers, just the same. Because if we're not aware about, and I don't know what you think, Krissy, but I think if we're not aware of our biases and and sort of the limits with our bodies or any other aspect of who we are, to us, how, if we're not honest about that, how can we create characters who are not us and be honest about this? How can we sort of examine the anxieties and of our times or desires generally if we're not sort of looking first into ourselves. And I think this is where emotional honesty is really important, to sort of do a lot of soul searching. It sounds hard, but I also think it sort of saves you a lot of money. You know, I think I saved a lot of money not going to therapists, but
Put it on the page instead.
Yeah,
absolutely. There's also, I mean, there's something that I come across time and time again where readers who maybe are being a bit lazy, kind of say, oh, I don't like that book because that character was unlikable. So this idea of unlikable characters somehow being something that you don't want to read, when actually unlikable characters are the ones that teach us the most about ourselves and the world. Can you talk a little bit about how you kind of approach that?
sure. I cannot agree more. I have the whole sort of big section in the book just about that. And my example is always Lolita. So probably I can see her head nodding. So one best masterpieces of the 20th century is written from the point of view of a pedophile. And this is the thing that Humbert Hunger, who is the narrator of this book, he is unlikable, but he's not a complete villain. So Nabokov sort of has the courage, the moral courage, because emotional honesty is about also writing. It's not about just insight, but also about the moral courage of showing us the world as it is rather than as we want it to be. And Chris and I talked about this before the event, about how some books, they just tell us how did you phrase it? Better?
They just kind of show the world that we expect to see without kind of challenging the way it is, and it ticks all the boxes of what you want for a happy ending and a happy story, and yeah.
Exactly right. So we do need moral courage to write a different book, and Alita is one of those books where they, because to change the world, you first need to understand it, I think. And so Humbert, who is a despicable character who does despicable things, he still has his good aspects too. Even, you know,
it's funny.
It is, in a way, charming, and what a great narrator. I mean, in the first page of the book, I still remember, I'm paraphrasing, but he talks about the blazing blue universe, you know, I mean, you just want, he's so charming, but you just get caught in his charms, you just want to follow him. And then you kind of realize, oh, I'm so enchanted by this man who is doing all these despicable things. Who am I? And I think once, and this is why unlikable characters are so great, because they really get us to question our own morals. So I think, again, emotional honesty is so fundamental in creating complex, interesting characters. Doesn't matter if it's fiction or non-fiction. I'm just thinking about the critique, William Gass, who's also a novelist, American writer, who said that any compelling character, any interesting character is also always a mix of good and bad. And I would add to this, because I used to work as a therapist too in my previous reincarnation, when I still was trying to avoid being a writer. But and I saw so many people come to me who really seemed like your average Joe. But once you start talking to people in real, honest terms, once you go a bit deeper, everyone has Shakespearean dramas in them. So everyone is very complex. So I don't think it's just the compelling character who will have this mix. I think everybody, just what we do with them on the page.
I suppose it's it's that thing that you see, one woman every week gets killed by their partner, and if you interviewed the neighbours or friends or other family members, oftentimes they're described as a lovely person who is charming, and they would have no idea that there was anything wrong in that relationship, and yet all those kind of horrors are bubbling around behind the scenes. And we can't see that. We can't just have someone who's just a bad person, because that doesn't exist in the real world as well. Very, very interesting chapter in your book, I have to admit. So you talked a little bit about how, we'll backtrack to the idea that you teach a lot. And I wonder whether your teaching has informed your writing of this book, or vice versa. Has your writing of this book actually changed the way you approach teaching?
Thank you. It's I wrote the book quite recently, and I didn't do enough teaching during the lockdowns. I mean, I did a lot of Zoom, but it's sort of not, so I didn't have yet a chance to sort of even catch my breath. But I suspect I will be reframing some of my classes differently now, but I thought so much more over such intense period of time about writing. I know that some writers really hate teaching, and they do it out of necessity. For me, it's never been like this. I actually, and I'm not trying to be nice about it or all kind of correct. It is my passion. When I was blocked, one of the things there were quite a few different things, a combination of things that helped me to exit those really quite depressing 4 years. It was a real crisis of confidence for me then, because I always, since I was very young, my whole identity was around writing. But one of the things that helped me with the writer's block at the time is actually what I was teaching. I didn't stop teaching because I get really inspired by students, because students usually, they're honest in class. In my classes, it's my experience about their struggles. So I don't have a lot of students who come to my classes and they're all happy. And those who do, who say, writing just comes naturally, it's so easy for me, those are usually the worst writers. Because the real writers, I know there's a lot of writers in this room, the real writers understand the weight of words, how much every word we choose matters. So they don't take it so, they don't just, I mean, you can move it on the page in your first draft, but then you start sort of, revising. I wonder if it's like this for you, Krissy, but just before, and I want to hear, but just to finish this sort of point. So hearing other people's struggles, but also passion and the tenacity that, often happens in creative writing classes, especially the it's an ongoing course, kind of really always rubs on me, and I come home and I want to write more. Well, and how is it for you, Krissy, like in terms of the vomit or the drafting?
Well, I'm not quite as attached to the individual words. Like I know most of my writer friends are, and I kind of feel like words are like, there's some words that are like blocks that you can fit any one of a dozen words into that spot and it would work. And you just have to make a choice. So I'm not kind of as fixed, and I think that might be because I've got dyslexia. And so when I actually read words on a page, I'm not necessarily reading exactly what the word is, because I sometimes insert another word thinking that's exactly what the word is and it's not. So for me, words are not as important. But I do think like writing is a hard job anyway, and it is. Yeah, I think you're right. I think the people who struggle with it are the people who are trying to get to something beyond just the words.
And yet, allow me to argue with you, Krissy, but I read quite a few of your books. And you do know how to choose the words. So maybe you're one of those lucky writers who your voice comes to you more sort of naturally, I think. Because I think for some of us, especially, I mean, look, I don't know enough about your process, Krissy, but from everything I've gathered, you're one of those people who your work ethic is pretty amazing, it seems to me. So I think because you do it so often and so much, you're much more connected to what's happening.
I do have, like, I noticed that you say in your book that you have like a little phrase that you have at your writing table. I can't remember what the phrase is. What was the phrase that you?
No, I can't remember too because I have a few of them.
There was something that I was just reading and I didn't write it down, but there was a phrase that was a quote from someone about writing. But I have.
Oh, is that about writing? Writers are those people who find writing difficult?
Yes, that's it.
Yes, Thomas Mann, the German novelist.
Yeah. And I have a little phrase above my table that says, "Easy words are better." And I came across this phrase when I was working with people with intellectual disabilities, and there were stickers that were like, "Easy words are better," and they'd stick them so that people kind of remembered that easy words are better. And so it's really interesting that you talk about words, because sometimes I'll read a book and I won't know what these words are and I'll have to go to a dictionary and look them up, but you will never do that in my books, because I don't use words that you'd have to look up in a dictionary. I only ever use easy words, but I put them in combinations that you don't see them in. So for me, use the easy word, but put it next to something that's a bit surprising. And I feel like then everyone can read it and everyone can be surprised, even someone who struggles with the individual words.
But see, the surprising element of how you put the words together is where it really comes together interestingly. Because I think this idea of words, the words don't have to be hard. It's more about how you evoke sort of emotion. When I read your work, especially when I was working with you on your essay, for example, you write so poetically. So
She's
and
nice.
but I've got experience. I'm a few. And also in your last memoir, it's real poetry.
And really.
So I don't think it's the difficult words that you have to change. They make the writing more beautiful. It's more about to me, when I think about the importance of words, I think about this on two levels. When I choose what word works, and I never choose them in the first draft. First draft I said I vomit, but then I revise. And this is when in the revision, the later stages of redrafting, I start thinking, what do I want this particular word to do? And I usually want it to do two things.
Yeah.
On first level, I want them to fit the action that I describe. So because think about just this little example, like if you say a woman walked into a room, it sounds really different than if you say a woman sashayed into a room. The whole gamut of emotions, of imagery sort of opens to you, and the sound, the swishy sound of sashayed. Some people will hate it, I love it. So for me, on one level, the word needs to fit the action. So I don't know if the woman walked into the room and not sashayed, I won't put sashayed. But on the other hand, the word for me personally as a writer also needs to fit my voice. And this is where it comes. So it's not about looking for words I don't know. It's more about looking for what's inside me. And for me, it's sometimes can be difficult. I find, so I sometimes, because I connected to my voice well, sometimes not as well. And so I have a whole sort of collection of words which I really love. For not necessarily, it's not about meaning, it's more about the sound and the sort of how they roll on my tongue. So I'm a bit like the Jewish Kabbalists. I think about words in all their dimensions.
Spells.
Yeah, what smells?
Spells. Well, words are spells.
Yeah, spells. Sorry, I thought you said smells.
Well, they can be as well.
That's a new dimension.
Well, it's interesting that you say this, because when you were just talking in passing before, I noticed that you said swimming in language. And, you know, even just the idea that in general talking, you say we are swimming in language, it makes you stop. And I know part of my brain was following that and watching you kind of swim in language and thinking about that while I was still talking to you. And I think that you do have a natural way of bringing metaphor that perhaps is enculturated and ideas that have come from other places that you've lived into this language now.
That's quite true. It's I mean, not now, but I've been here for 22 years. But when
You
I
still
started,
do it.
true, but when I just really started writing in English, it was actually good for me in some ways not to know the language very well because I just did not know the cliches. So I was less likely to use them. But just very quickly about this idea of words, and then I'll stop. So it's my pet subject.
Oh no, please go,
Now.
please go.
I just want to say that like there's some words, and that says something about me, of course, that are really attached so much. So if whenever I can sort of get them into the book, I would, even, as long as they don't completely sort of stand out. So like more like metamorphose. If I can write metamorphose instead of change and not sound like a total wanker, I'll do it. That's all.
That's the trick. There's a lot of this book has a lot of. It's rich. It's really rich. Like I feel very sad that I had to cram it in one day because there is so much that you can just kind of go down the rabbit hole of all these. The research that you've done, the physical sheer, quotes from other writers, and the amount of books that you must have read to be able to kind of distill those ideas. Can you talk a little bit about how did you keep track? Because in some paragraphs, you're talking about Helen Garner, you're talking about maybe Chekhov, you're talking about all these writers that come to the same idea. How do you keep track of those ideas?
I suppose, thank you. I suppose that's where the fact that I'm a teacher of writing as well comes in handy, because I've been teaching for, oh my God, the time. So when I speak like this, I've just realized how old I am now. I've been teaching for at least 15 years.
Wise you are.
Oh, thank you. Like that. Babushka, yeah. So yeah, as an old babushka, I've been teaching for over 15 years now. And I do sort of tend to be like, what is the bird who collects all the feathers? Bowerbird, thank you. Yeah, so I'm like a bowerbird. I sort of collect those quotes and leave for them because I always use them for my classes. But there's
do you put them in, like, sorry, this is very technical, but do you kind of put them in folders or something? How do you, I don't know, I read something and think, that's fantastic, I underline it and then it's gone. I don't know where I read it or who wrote it or what, but you seem to kind of have that to hand.
Well, I'm very anal, so I do have a reading diary which I have kept since 2004, and I record every book I read, and so every quote that I really means to me, I put there. So there's lots. They're all electronic. This diary, there's loads of them. It's very easy to get lost.
Yeah, wow.
But also when I teach, so I usually teach with PowerPoint, so I've got a lot of sort of slides where I keep those my most sort of treasured quotes. But also, if anybody wants to sort of have I'm sure people here are very smart and already have their own quotes, but if you want sort of to have a crash course and really good sort of ideas from great writers, my best recommendation is Paris Review interviews. Those volumes are just priceless.
I love them.
Yeah, they're just great.
Even writers that you've never read their actual work, you read the interview and just think, this is enough. I've just got so much out of this interview.
That's right. Sometimes actually I read writers who I don't like them that much, like Jack Kerouac. I'm not crazy about his prose, but his interview is one of the best interviews I've ever read. So, so you just get one volume of Paris Review interviews, and they're sort of really good because they start in 1950s. And then they go progressively until sort of 2000 something. So you really get sort of really good overview.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, or you could just get this book and then all the quotes are in the one place in this one book. It really is. So what you talk a little bit about in the book about reading like a writer, and we've talked about Paris Review interviews, which is reading, but how differently do writers read to an ordinary just sort of person off the street who's just reading for pleasure? What is the difference between your reading styles?
Can I throw it back at you, please?
Sure.
Do you feel you read differently when you read for like to learn? Or?
I feel like I've lost the ability to read like I did when I was 10 now. So I feel like I can't just read for pleasure anymore. In fact, I don't read any books for pleasure. I do read graphic.
Netflix is good.
TV is good. I do read graphic novels for pleasure because the ideas that are embedded in the pictures are sometimes more illuminating than kind of reading. But yeah, you do the same thing. You read, or do you have pleasure reads now?
I still have pleasure, although after having written this book, I sort of lost it because I was reading a lot. But no, I do still get a lot of pleasure out of books, because not every book I read is a writer. So I've got those books I read not like a writer.
Oh, what are they? I want to know.
Well, at the moment it's Anna Karenina.
A little bit of light.
I know, but terrible. It's not something good, but you want to set apart, part to it. So,
I read Anna Karenina for pleasure.
you get banished from the next debate.
No. But yeah, so what's the difference between reading Anna Karenina to reading other books that you?
So there's a lot of aspects to what I see as reading as a writer. And I won't cover them all, of course, now, but one of the fundamental things for me when I read, and I think quite a lot of writers I know do similar things, when I'm in the middle of writing a book really intensely, I go what I call on the reading diet. And so I'm extremely watchful of what I'm reading, because I'm sorry about being so vulgar, but reading is like food. It's like whatever you put in is what it comes out as well. So for me,
You're going to be pooping those books into your own.
Thank you for saying it, and it is emotional,
honestly. You have a writer. True. So what are the books that feed your own writing? Can you talk about those?
Sure. So I have to sort of be very mindful of first of all, I have to start from a negative thing and think what will interfere with my writing. So when I write, I usually want, my writing is relatively sort of, now I'm going to, if anybody wants to buy my books now, nobody really will buy them because my writing is quite dreamy. It's not sort of, and I don't have huge amounts of dialogue. And I usually, when I write, I'm really preoccupied with creating a certain mood in the reader. So as much as I love, for example, Jonathan Franzen, I would never read his novels while I'm writing a really sort of intense book, because I know his voice will interfere with my voice, and I'll just, I'll be just frustrated. I'm not writing like him, because he has a lot of dialogue, very hyper realistic, whereas I'm not magical realism, but I'm sort of, my writing does have a bit of I don't know how to say it without sounding pretentious, but a bit of a metaphysical bent.
More poetic.
Thank you. But also I do think, because I come from, I rebelled at 14, but I'm from a very ultra-Orthodox religious family. My mother was a Whig. So I am sort of, I do, as much as I find my background, I do sort of come from this sort of word of Bible and that sort of stuff. So I can't read beyond Jonathan Franzen when I write, for that reason too. And Salman Rushdie is a bit like this. So when he writes his novels, for example, he only reads poetry because he wants to keep his poetic voice coming. He's a very poetic writer, of course. Another aspect of reading as a writer is, and this is where we get into the pleasure versus non-pleasure, is when I write a particular book, I'm in the middle of it, I try to read much more analytically, as you probably do, Krissy. So I try to do what Picasso said all artists should do, because he said all artists theft. So I'm not trying to sort of steal words and sentences, but I do try to understand how writers do what they do. And so I'm thinking like about Joan Didion. She's a really big influence for me, especially when I write creative nonfiction. Her sentences, I always try to understand, because her sentences are just like magic utterances. They're just like so, they just lure you. They just make you feel, doesn't matter what she writes about the Doors or the Beatles or whatever it is, it really lures you. So I always try, so if I want to enjoy Joan Didion, I'll just read her book quickly and not think about it much. But when I want to learn, I'll read it again and I'll be sort of reanalyzing it closely. So I get what you say about pleasure versus not reading for pleasure. Totally get that.
And yet I didn't mean that there's no pleasure in reading anymore when you're a writer, because sometimes you'll read a book that you think, I want to write just like this. And that becomes this pleasure in itself, to kind of read something that you know that you're nowhere near as good as, and you just want to be as good as that. And I feel like that's some kind of an excitement, some kind of a pleasure as well. Are there other writers that do that for you, that make you excited like that?
Yeah, a lot actually. One of my most recent obsessions is a writer who he's like Woody Allen. Some people really hate him, some people really love him. I'm not talking about him personally, but the works. It's Karl Ove Knausgård, a Norwegian writer who writes about changing nappies and shopping for broccoli in the supermarket. And then at the same time, he also gives you 600 pages essay on Hitler and his youth, and and his book. And you would think nobody will buy books like this, and his books sell like he's a best-selling writer, like in whole, in many different countries. So that was one of my obsessions. And just one more, I mean, I can go on and on, of course, but
And in the book, there's quite a few listed too.
yes, absolutely. But like another one, more of the recent obsessions was Elena Ferrante, of course. And somehow in my head, and I might be wrong, but in my head, so Elena Ferrante and Knausgård go together, even though men, women, different voices, different preoccupation. But it's something about the uncompromised honesty, about the integrity, about the willingness to slaughter sacred cows and not to go with the mainstream beliefs of the era, really does it to me. They really shy away from any ideology. They really manage to avoid ideology. So Elena Ferrante, for example, writes, because I'm a junkie, so I read her novels, but I also read a lot of her work writing, and she talks a lot about how, and interviews with her. So she talks about how she has always considered herself a feminist, and she was actually, if she a real person, who she says she is, but she was supposedly active politically in a feminist movement. But she says, when I go and write my novels, I completely divorce myself from that. I just dare to tell the story. And see, to me, this is sort of my, this is not, and I think Knausgård is the same thing as well.
They also both write about the domestic, although I think Ferrante gets listed as being more writing about domestic than Knausgård does as well.
Lots,
yes. So I realised the time. I should actually go to questions now. I have so many more myself, but are there any questions from the audience or questions on Zoom as well? Any questions from the audience here? Yes, Bianca.
Lee, in your book, you mentioned your 4 writing tenets, and I wonder how it came about distilling them, and if you could talk to them a little bit more, if it's, if you're able to, especially the first one. I just want to understand, reading the book a bit more to get into it. But yeah, so often that question is posed to writers is, what's your best piece of advice? And there's so much out there, like there are wonderful quotes. So how did you come to those 4?
Thank you, Bianca. I must say, I brought lots of books to Brisbane with you, but not my own book was the first tenet there.
To writers to read.
Oh yes, well this is, yeah. So I really think, especially being a teacher, now I'm putting my didactic teacher hat, but if I had $1 for every time I get a student who tells me they don't read much, I would be very rich now. I wouldn't need to teach. So I really think that even though it's an obvious thing with writers to read, but to me it's not as obvious, because I always all my life sort of felt guilty when I was reading, and I always thought, oh, this is a guilty pleasure and I should be actually sitting at my desk and writing. And it took me a long time to realize that, at least for me, but I believe it's just not me like that. 50% of my writing time should be reading, and that's sort of, I kind of follow that now for a long time, because I really think because I really think, especially if we read books which, like Krissy, you said, there are some books you read and they just really inspire you because you want to write like this. And I think this type of reading really feeds us so much. I mean, and I said in the book, but if you read a book where you think, well, that's nice, I could write a book like this, then you're not reading what you should be reading. You always need to write about yourself.
That's very true. Any other questions from the audience here? I'm going to prompt you before you ask any more questions, because I really wanted to know, when you were writing not in English, you wrote fiction, and since you've been writing in English, it's all been non-fiction. I wanted to know a little bit about that divide, and whether it's exactly the same thing, writing fiction and non-fiction, or whether it's completely different and the languages determined it.
Well, I could talk about this for an hour, so I'll try to do it in 5 minutes, in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
I've always been kind of autobiographical writer. I want to say confessional, but I don't, confessional writing has such a bad reputation. But what I mean by confessional, I just think that writers can be divided roughly to two types, and I'm going to get into trouble for this, I know. But I think there's the type of writers who write because they want to escape the world and reimagine the world of their own making. And there are the writers who write because they want to understand the world and especially their experiences. So I think I'm the second type of writer. So my fiction was always quite autobiographical, even if it didn't seem so. Like my second book was a collection of short stories, mostly narrated by men, but every one of those men had some anxiety I was battling with, or some moral dilemma I was sort of thinking about. And the reason I wrote only fiction until I came to Australia is very simple and funny. I don't know if it's so funny, but until I came to Australia, I didn't know creative nonfiction existed.
Oh.
Which is really interesting, and I think it partly tells who I was in Israel, because in Israel, as I said before, I was living in all those sort of very city neighborhoods. My friends were, call girls and drug dealers, and then later I moved to the nightlife scene and I organized parties. So clubbers were my friends. So nobody sort of talked about literature much. And then I came to Australia and I discovered there's such thing as creative nonfiction. And I just really, the genre really resonated with me at the time, because in my fiction, I always was trying to do what creative nonfiction does. But now, having written so much in creative nonfiction, I'm thinking maybe my next book will be fiction.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Be interesting to come back here and unpick it and go, okay, which bit's are real? Who's that character? Be very interesting.
Yep.
Hi, Lee, you talked a little bit earlier in the book about doing a PhD and sort of how you came to do that, that it was in social sciences, but you obviously teach in writing and literature. So I'm wondering if you've got some thoughts on the idea that, qualifications for writing. So, do you need to have an MFA? Do you need to do a PhD in creative writing? Does that, I'm sure it helps, but yeah, is that a must-have, or what's your thinking on qualifications, especially now, like, I guess, if you're wanting to be published, or if you're wanting to establish yourself in Australia, do you find that was something that you felt you needed to do, or that you think writers should do?
Thank you for asking me a question that's going to get me into a lot of trouble now. Because I quite passionately feel that to be a writer, you do not need to study too much, even though I'm making my living.
Unless it's your courses, yeah.
Exactly. So I know it's very. I think, I've in recent years, I've done a lot of assessment job and judging and things like this, and I've read a lot of manuscripts around Australian fiction and memoir genre, but not necessarily published yet. And what I've noticed in the last years, and I wonder, Krissy, if you have what you take on this, but I've noticed that the prose has really, really improved. The craft also, the plotting has really improved if you look at what we get these days. But the quality is going down because there's so much formulaic work out there. And I'm not talking about necessarily genre writing. Genre writing, I have no problem with being formulaic because that's what genre writing is often about. But in literary works, there's a lot of formulaic stuff. And I think it's, and I blame this on too much learning, too much university courses, too much qualifications, as we say. When people just learn to write at somebody else, and there's all these conventions and too much workshopping. I have actually a chapter in the book which I call exposure, and I talk there about how I think we expose our writing sometimes way too much, and we need to live with this in secrecy. And I think and look, I might be very biased, so I'll declare my biases here because I've done my PhD was in social sciences, and my initial training is in social work, but I did a master's in creative writing, and for me it was good and bad. So the good thing was I made really great lifelong wonderful friends there. There's quite a few now known writers who were in my master's degree, but in terms of my work, I think I only got more confused because I got all these big ideas, but I started writing in a very pretentious way. That was actually when I got blocked too. There was partly of that. So no, I don't think writers need qualification. I think writers need to read and to be friends with other writers and be in literary circles as much as possible and think big ideas and just be interested in the world generally. That's the best apprenticeship for us, I think. But I'm an idealist,
there are some big critiques out there about the MFA programs in the US and talking about how particular teachers will teach the same particular sets of work over and over again. So all of those classes just try and write like Raymond Carver. And so you just get everybody wanting to write like Raymond Carver, and it's like Raymond Carver's great, but like we don't need 3,000 Raymond Carvers.
Absolutely, and I think it's also there's a trend now. This is I can't blame it on writing degrees, but there's a trend now with publishers and agents that if you submit something, you've got to say, my book is like I don't know what to write. So you're like this and this bit, right?
Yeah, you have to have something that's like, something.
Yeah. I'll use American writers. My book is like Stephen King crossed with Jack Kerouac. And I think this sort of thinking also influences writers who just start writing or want to publish, and I think, oh, I have to write like somebody else. But you know, I dedicated this book to a very dear friend of mine and my unofficial mentor, Peter Bishop, who used to be the director of Verona. And I remember how many things I learned from Peter when I first met him. He's one of the most interesting erudite of people to talk to writing about in Australia. And he taught me what the best measure for writing, for literary work, is strange. It has to have some strangeness. And that's why too much learning, too much writing programs, they just take away the strangeness because you workshop and try to be like follow the rules.
Very.
Sorry, I got my passion.
Yeah. Well, we've got time for one last question. Is anyone on Zoom as well? Is there a Zoom question?
Yeah, we've got one question here. There might be some more inside, but
Yep, let's go for two then. So one question from Zoom and then we'll go to you.
yeah. So you both talked about being sort of in your body when you write, but have you ever had a sort of out of body experience? This person finds when they write and take themselves out of the equation. It's almost like a spiritual experience. But when they're conscious in their body, their writing is constipated.
What do you think about that? So writing out of your body rather than from writing inside of your body. Have you ever experienced that?
No, I only can get more bodily because when my writing goes, especially well, I'm very sorry to say this, but it feels almost like an orgasm.
That's nice.
Very
Good
flexible.
reason to actually write, I think. That's good. I just take the point that there's some writing that you read which is not the sort of writing that I generally write, but I will read it and I'll kind of go, this is working on this intellectual kind of plane that doesn't really feel bodily at all. Works, it's fantastic, and it works for that writer. But and I think people like Italo Calvino, for instance, sometimes have that experience where I love the ideas and I feel like I'm all in my head, but he doesn't plummet me into my body like other writers do.
Yeah, I get that. I'm not a kind of Calvino person.
Well, I love his work, but it's not
Yeah.
what I write. Yeah.
It's not how, yeah.
Yeah. And question.
You said something when you were talking about voice that made me think this, and you've touched on it again, and I'll have to buy the collection, the short stories that you wrote from the point of view of men.
Do you speak Hebrew?
It's not in English.
Sorry.
I might learn it. Well, you've thrown down the gauntlet.
I shouldn't have said that.
No.
So the word, and it's a bit of a buzzword, I think, I'll put it in inverted commas, the notion of appropriation. So it's okay for you to write in the voice of men. Do you believe we can write, so I can write as a woman? Like that, that's the question I'm asking.
That's a good question. It's a very loaded question now times, isn't it, Krissy?
It's a very long conversation, but yeah, the quick answer.
Yeah, okay, it is a long conversation. The very quick answer I can say is that I think writers should be allowed to try, but it's really hard to get it really well without appropriating and without and pulling it off being authentic. And I'll go to safer territory because I'm Jewish, okay? So it's easier for me to talk about, non-Jewish people writing of Jewish characters, okay? So I personally don't have any moral issue with a non-Jewish person writing a book about the Holocaust or having Jewish characters. The opposite, I love to see more Jewish characters in writing. But what I notice is that often if a non-Jewish writer has a Jewish character, it's a very either very bad or very good character. And that's where I think it's the problem. So it's not, for me, it's a question of art. how do you make somebody a complex character? It's hard to get away with, I suppose. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, look, I mean, as only just recently realizing that I have always been a non-binary person, I don't have quite the same relationship to the binary of male and female, because I actually have never really struggled to understand that there's such a divide, because some of the people who are men are more feminine than some of the people that I know who are women. And so I've always struggled with this idea of this divide. So for me, writing gender is always a game and is always play, because I don't really believe in the fundamental nature of gender. I do think that if you live with a penis or a vagina, you need to do your research if you're going to write about them, because it's pretty easy to get it, like just little tiny embodied things wrong. If you haven't got one, you might not realise it doesn't work that way. So, you know, it's pretty good to do your research, and to also kind of, and that embodiment of having that particular genital means that you understand something about the world in a different way because of that. So, you know, it's a fine line between actually writing exactly, absolutely from within your own bodily experience of the world, and also this idea that you might be putting on a costume and pretending to be the Jewish character and not actually understanding what it is to be Jewish and getting it completely wrong. And I think it's very easy to do that. So I wouldn't attempt to write from a different cultural background, because it's so easy to really muck it up, and it's so hard to get it right. And why not just write from something that is a bit easier? I think that's where I don't know, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but suppose, yeah, I think you had somebody wanted to say something as well.
Is there time?
Yeah, let's do it. We've started a bit late, we've got another couple of
Okay,
minutes.
I was just thinking, as you were talking about this, about that situation with Yasmin Abdul-Magid walking out of the interview with Lionel Shriver a few years ago at the Queensland Writers' Festival, where Lionel Shriver was saying that it's the exercise of the imagination to put yourself into someone else's experience. But then there's that whole thing, and I come from a social science background too. I've just finished doing a PhD in anthropology, and it's that whole thing of positionality and who you are and who you're speaking for, surely. So I think I can understand what you're saying about gender experience, but I think that there's a whole range of things there, you know, that thing of when you are distinctly female and identify as that feeling that you have of fear at night walking alone along the street. How can anybody else understand that if they haven't had that?
Yeah, but which is not necessarily to do with your genitals, it's to do with how you present in the world
No,
and
exactly.
how you feel.
And that's
Yeah.
what I'm talking
Yeah.
about.
But just to be a devil's advocate,
Oh, we will go on.
one of my very favorite novels is Madame Bovary. And Flaubert famously said Madame Bovary is, it's me, I can't say it in French, but and I think he really pulls through there the experience of what it is to be a woman at this time, at that time, at that particular situation. Whereas the Anna Karenina I'm reading now, it's a good novel, but I can really sense that Tolstoy just does not get the women. Nah, sorry, Tolstoy. So I guess my point here is that it's okay to try. And then you may come up with a very good novel like Anna Karenina, but still some people like me will critique and say, nah, that's not good enough. But then somebody like Flaubert will do magic somehow. I don't know how he does it. Maybe he had an out-of-body experience.
There's not just, I think that the difference too is that there's not just one experience of being a woman.
Exactly.
And that some women feel happy walking around at night because of their physicality or because they've been in a privileged suburb or whatever, and they're different to how other people might feel walking around. So I think that idea that we're not all the one person means that within a particular cultural group, it's easier to kind of be a little bit more flexible. Whereas I think jumping outside a cultural group and going to another completely different experience, it's just so, it's almost like play acting, because there's going to be so much you don't even know you've gotten wrong.
It's really hard, that's right, because I read a lot of literature, of course, by Jewish writers, and sometimes I get so worked up and say, that's not how I see it, you know, so it's very hard, yeah.
Sorry, couple of books that I've read in the past. One of them is One Foot Wrong by Sophie Levine, and another is The Curious Case of the Dog in the Bathroom. Both of them are kind of voiced by children or adolescents that have the voice of someone with disability, intellectual disability. And I mean, those are very important books, and I love them. And I don't have an intellectual disability, and to my knowledge, neither do the authors.
The Curious Incident, his son has a disability.
Yeah, and all three of my children do too. And I just found that they're such amazing books. And yet, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because writing about someone from that voice is still, you know, that's your child, but it's not you. And it's a funny little dichotomy.
It's a line, isn't it? And the line is shifting. I think if we had this conversation in 2 years' time, it would be completely different. If we had this conversation 10 years ago, we wouldn't be having the conversation.
That's exactly right. Thanks, Krissy, for saying that. I just want to quickly say
Let's
that.
have the.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say we're going to have one last question over there.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So we get off. Now, I just want to quickly say with Sophie Laguna, I know her a little bit, and she is an actress as well. So I think she had really, I mean, I really admire her talent, and I think she really has this great way of getting into the heads of characters, also being an actor. So speaking of body, she probably knows in her body how to do it. I don't know. So you have to be, I suppose what we, I mean, I don't want to generalize, but what I'm saying at least is that you can try, but you have to be a really, really good writer to pull it through. I suppose that's my bottom line here in this.
And also there are some people whose stories haven't been told, and we should maybe step aside for them to tell them as well. Sorry, Chris.
I just wanted to make a comment. I've just finished reading Donna Tartt's The Little Friends, and she had all these different points of view, and she called it symphonic, I think. So it was from the point of view of the 12-year-old girl, then there was the ancient mother and the drug addict here, and then the African American, maid, and it was so, I mean, she is a fabulous writer, but it was so interesting to get this vast, community.
Yes, yes.
So deeply involved.
Yes,
And
and
it
if
would take it on, it's what it takes.
totally agree with you. I mean, of course, and that's what writers not like me, who are not confessional writers, usually do really well. I mean, if you think about just one example more sort of Australian, if you think about The Slap, which I just love, I got in a book at the end of it, 100 books I really loved, and The Slap is there. I mean, he really gives us such a plethora of such interesting voices there. Very much not like him, but probably like him. I suppose if I was now to approach this topic just very quickly from creative perspective as opposed to from political, I would say that when I write, because I still write a little bit of fiction here and there, like short stories, when I write a character who is not like me at all, doesn't matter in which way, gender, whatever it would be, I often try to think what could be the commonality between me and this person. So for example, if I were to write, I haven't tried that yet, but if I were to write about somebody who has had experience with drug abuse, I've never tried like hard drugs or anything like that. Or maybe I didn't, I don't want to tell you, but no, I didn't. But if I were to try, I would be thinking about other types of addictions I had. I used to have addiction to bad boyfriends. So here you go.
That's it. Look, we could go on. I think this is a topic we could talk about for so long, because everyone does want to talk about it and nut it out. It's important when we have these conversations, particularly about bad boyfriends. But now is a good time to thank you, Lee, for writing this book and for bringing it to us and coming all the way to Queensland to bring it to us. So thank you very much. So we're gonna go inside now. So to let this happen a bit easier, we might just let Lee out first, so that we can get to the table more easily.